And welcome back. As we continue looking at pixel art, we are going to today look at something that we have discussed before, and that is the concept of value. Now, we have so far dealt with images that are primarily two different shades here. So we have, of course, either images that are black or images that are white. We don't really have much kind of in between with that. We don't have any gray. Now, adding in gray into a black and white image allows us to add some contrast, allows us to add some value. And just to kind of refresh some of our terminologies here, let's just quickly add some hue and saturation to this image. So for example, if I am looking at hue, this is going to refer to the color that we are dealing with. Now, of course, because I'm on a black and white scale, you can see this is kind of becoming a gray scale here. But if we look at saturation, that is referring to how rich a particular color is. If I look, of course, at lightness, that is referring to the luminosity here. So you can see as I adjust the lightness, it will refer to those pixels changing different colors and tones. Now let's take a step back. I'm just going to go ahead and remove this layer mask and the hue and saturation. So we can go back to our black and white. And I want to jump over real quick to our swatches panel. Now in here, of course, I have different options. For example, if I click on this swatch, I can make this red. But I'm right now not worried about color. In fact, I'm not even going to bother with going into the RGB gradient here, which of course would allow me to add basic colors like red, yellow, etc. Instead, I want to go ahead and go down a little bit further to the grayscale swatch. And you can see in here, we are going from white to black with a bunch of grays in between. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is to show that contrast that we have talked about before. So let's go ahead and fill this existing image. I'm just going to go ahead and fill it with white so we can kind of start over. And let's kind of take ourselves back to some of our previous images. So for example, I'm going to go back to having black just to start. And let's think about, for example, one of the very first things we did was a smiley face, right? There's something really simple that we did, and it allowed us to kind of demonstrate real quickly of some of the very basic concepts that we were exploring. Now, when we look at this face here, one of the things that we notice is that we do not have a ton of options in terms of how this looks. It's just black and white. But let's say we wanted to add a little grayscale to it to show things like shadows or lighting. Then I can come over here to my grayscale gradient and I can do that. Now I could, of course, double click on this and just pick a gray along that scale. But the advantage of using this pre-made swatch is that if I want to, for example, let's say I start off with this lighter gray here and I start coloring in some areas, then I switch to a darker gray later on, I still have that ability to do so, to go back to it because that color is right there. Or even more, if I forget which color I had picked on before, I can always go over here to the eyedropper tool and then click on that color in order to fill it in. So to start, let's choose something really light to kind of fill in this side over here, because we want to maybe show that that side's basking in sunlight. And then I'm going to go up a few squares to kind of fill that in maybe a little bit more. And I'm going to leave the eyes a little bit darker simply because that's the part of the image that we want to draw attention to. And let's do a little bit darker here. And I'll go a little darker for these squares. And a little darker for the outside. Now, of course, these are a little too dark for my liking, so I'm just going to go ahead, darken those up. And maybe down one more. There we go. Now, of course, this is a little too light there, so I'm going to just shade that a little bit, just to add a little bit of contrast. All right, and I can look at this and say, well, this side's not dark enough. I have the ability to easily click, go back and say, you know, I want that just to be a little bit darker. I want to show just a little bit more contrast here in this image, so everything is not quite so uniform, maybe. There, and now we have an image that is showing contrast. It's the same image as what we had before. However, the big difference that we have now is that we are using values to add a lot more dynamic flavor to our image. Let's just go ahead and look at this with one more example. So let's go ahead and create another 8x8 image. Go ahead and zoom that in. And let's go ahead and make sure we go back to black. And let's think about something else that we could have, or one of the other images that we made. Let's just go ahead and say we made something simple, like let's say a tree. So I'm going to go ahead and make a real quick tree here. All right. Now it might be hard to tell that this is indeed a tree, but if we start adding some contrast to it, it can make it look much more dynamic. So for example, we might say, you know what, I don't want this tree this dark. Maybe I want to make the trunk, maybe this nice kind of grayscale here. All right. Or I can also have it, maybe the grayscale goes on this side, and we're going to pretend that the sun is shining down from this side. So this side will be a lot lighter. Maybe not that light, but just a little bit enough to show some contrast within the scale of this image. Next, let's go ahead and add a little bit here into the tree itself. So again, we want to have some dark colors here along the edge. Now, of course, this is just a gradient effect that we have done right now. But the thing about trees, what do we have in trees that can help separate them apart? Well, on top of having just the sunlight coming down like this, we can also go maybe a shade darker and do things such as adding in leaves. So maybe I'm going to grab like this shade and just put some random splotches in here of things that might be a little bit darker, just to represent maybe something that's actually inside that tree, to show that this is not just your ordinary everyday object. And if we look at it down here in our thumbnail, or even if I hit Control minus, just to zoom out a little bit, you can see how it's starting to stand out. Now, it may not be the best. Again, we're working with 8 by 8 pixels here, but we are, of course, creating something that has a lot more value. We have a lot more contrast, a lot more hue and saturation values that were manipulated in order to create these images. And we are going to use all this in order to create images that are far richer, because before long, we're going to be working with color.